All right, so the next React design pattern that we're going to take a look at is controlled and uncontrolled components. Now, this is a very, very common pattern to find in React, both of these, both controlled and uncontrolled components. So let's take a look at what both of these mean. First, let's start off by defining uncontrolled components. Uncontrolled components are basically React components where the component itself keeps track of all its own internal state. And really the only time we get data out of that component is when some event occurs. So this would be in the case of, let's say, a form. When the user hits the submit button, in an uncontrolled form, that would be the only time we actually know what values the inputs of that form contain. Controlled components, on the other hand, are basically components where their parent is the one that takes care of keeping track of the state, and that state is then usually passed through to a controlled component as a prop of some sort. So those are just the basic definitions. Let's take a look at what this might look like in code. For uncontrolled components, more often than not, the component itself, again, is going to be the one that keeps track of its own state. So what this is going to look like, up here at the top, we see that this component has its own useState hook, and the only prop that it's getting passed is this onSubmit prop, which, the parent component would pass a function to actually get the values of that component's state when the submit event is triggered. With controlled components, on the other hand, we see that our component no longer has that useState hook. In other words, the state of that component is passed through as props. And of course, there's other kinds of functions that this component is going to use as well. You'll see how this works very shortly when we take a look at some examples of this. So one question that comes up when we talk about uncontrolled and controlled components is, which one do we generally prefer? Well, more often than not, we're going to prefer controlled components, and there are several reasons for this. The main reason is that it just makes our components more reusable, and it also makes them a lot easier to test, since we can just set up a component with the exact state we want, instead of having to create the component, manually make some changes, and then trigger some event to find out what's going on inside of it. So in other words, controlled components are just easier to test, they're more reusable, we more often than not will prefer them. All right, so now that we know some of the basic theory behind controlled and uncontrolled components, let's take a look at some examples of what they're going to look like in code. Now, we're going to start off by taking a look at forms, since controlled and uncontrolled forms are the most commonly used types of components in React. So let's start off here by creating an uncontrolled form, and we'll see exactly how that works. And before you get started here, make sure that you copy the starting state of the exercise files, since it's a little different than how we left it off in the previous chapter. And you're also going to want to make sure you run npm install before running your code. And just like before, we're going to run this app by running npm run start in the terminal. Okay, so we're going to start off by creating an uncontrolled form component. So let's add a new file to our project called uncontrolledform.js. And here's what an uncontrolled form in React is going to look like. Basically, this uncontrolled form is going to defer most of its logic to the actual DOM elements underneath. Let me show you what I mean. We're going to start off here by saying import React from React. Then we're going to export our component here by saying export const uncontrolled form. And the JSX for this form is going to look like this. We're going to have a form. Inside that form, we're going to have several inputs. So let's just say that this form is collecting information about a user. All right, so we'll have input, we'll have name equals name, type equals text, and we'll have a placeholder here that says name. Okay, and we're going to have several more inputs of different types. The one underneath that is going to be an age input, the type is going to be number, and the placeholder here will be age. Under that, we're going to have hair color. For the name, the type will be text, and the placeholder will be hair color. And finally, we're going to have an input which is going to be the submit button. So we're going to say We're going to remove the name. We're going to say type equals submit. And value here, this is just going to be the text of this button, is going to be submit. Okay? So here's where the uncontrolledness of this form comes in. Basically what we're going to do is our form is going to handle the onSubmit event. And for this, we're going to add a handle submit function up here in our component. We'll say const handle submit. And inside here is the only place that we're really going to do any kind of logic with the values from our form. Now, in order to actually get those values from our form, what we need to do is create some React refs. And the way we do that is by saying something like const name input equals react.createRef. And then what we do is we pass this name input ref as a prop to our input. So we would say something like ref equals name input. And then we do the same thing for the other inputs that we need to get the value of. So we'll have an age input ref, and we'll have a hair color input ref. And we'll pass those as props to these other inputs. We'll say ref equals age input, and ref equals hair color input. Okay, and then when this form is actually submitted, when the user clicks this submit button, what we do is we simply get the current values of those inputs by saying something like this. I'm just going to log it out to the console for now. We'll say console.log name input.current.value, and then we do the same thing for our other inputs as well. So we might have age input.current.value and hair color input.current.value. And then we would want to say e.prevent default, because the default behavior of a form when we submit it is to refresh the page. And we also need to add e as an argument here, which is just the event that's occurring in this onSubmit handler. Okay, so that's our uncontrolled form. The way that we're going to use that in our higher component here would be to do something like this. We would say import uncontrolled form from uncontrolled form. And we would just display it in here like this. And let's go see what that will look like. We're just going to enter something in here and click submit. And if we open up our console here, oops, it looks like I misspelled on submit in our uncontrolled form here. There we go. Let's try that again. And submit. And we'll see that sure enough, it logs out the values of those inputs. Now, again, what makes this uncontrolled is that this component isn't really caring about what the values of each of these inputs is until some event occurs, right? Basically, each of these inputs is just handling its own state until we submit the form, at which point we get all of the values. Okay, so now that we've seen what an uncontrolled form looks like, let's take a look at what a controlled form is going to look like and how it's different. So we're going to start off by creating a new file here, which we'll call controlledform.js. And our component is going to look like this. We're going to say export const controlled form equals, and then we'll have the body of our component. And the main difference with our controlled form is going to be that we're going to track the values of each of our form's inputs using a useState hook. So what this is going to look like, we're going to start off by importing the useState hook up here, import useState from React. And then inside our controlled form component, we're going to create state variables for all of the inputs that we're going to be inserting into our form. So we're going to say const name set name equals useState, and the starting value is going to be an empty string. Const age set age equals useState. We'll just leave the initial value empty for that. And const hair color set hair color equals use state, and the initial value for that will be an empty string. Okay, so now that we have these three different state variables, we're going to create our form in JSX. Okay, so we've got our form. Inside that, we're going to have a few inputs. So we're going to say input. The name for this first one will be name. The type will be text. The placeholder is going to be name, just like we had before. Now, where this starts to differ from our uncontrolled form that we had before is we're going to actually pass in the value to each of these inputs, right? So the value for each of these inputs, that is the text that each input currently contains, is going to be equal to the current value of the corresponding state variable. So the value of our name input is going to be equal to the name state. All right? And the other thing that's different is that each of these inputs is going to have an onChange handler that will basically take care of updating each of these state variables whenever the user starts to change the value inside the text input, say by typing. So what this is going to look like is we're going to say e, that's the event, by the way, and we're going to say set name to e.target.value. Basically what that's doing is it's setting the name state to the target value of this text input, right? Basically whatever the user is trying to type in or paste or whatever. Okay, and that is what our inputs are going to look like in controlled forms. Just to make this a little more readable, I'm going to put each of these props on its separate line. Just a little easier to read there since we don't have the horizontal scroll. So that's our name input. Let's define our age and hair color inputs as well. This one here is going to have name equal to age. The type is going to be number. The placeholder is going to be age. The value is going to be age. And for onChange, we're going to say set age to e.target.value. And since the value that we get from text inputs is always going to be a string, even when it's of type number, we're going to say number and explicitly convert that target value to a number. And finally, with our hair color input, we're going to say name equals hair color, type equals text, placeholder equals hair color, and value equals our hair color state, okay? And for onChange, we're going to say set hair color to e.target.value, and that's all we need to do, okay? So again, what each of these inputs is doing, what our controlled form is doing, that is it's creating a two-way binding between the value of each of these inputs and the value of each of these state variables. And I'll show you in just a second what that allows us to do. Okay, the last thing that our form needs, though, before we do that, is just a button here that will say submit. And generally, when we're not relying on the onSubmit event, we just have a regular button inside of our form instead of a input of type submit, okay? All right, so that's what a controlled form looks like, but what are the benefits of this kind of thing? Well, the main benefit, the one that I use most often anyway, is that controlled forms allow us to do things like form validation while the user's typing. In other words, before the user has tried to submit the form, we can give them feedback about the values that they've entered in. Let me show you how that's going to work. So first of all, we're going to import the use effect hook from React. And what we're going to do is we're going to have this use effect hook listen for changes in any one of these state variables. The way we're going to do that is by saying use effect. And we have our function here. And the second argument is going to be an array of values that we want to listen for. So we'll just start off with name, right? Basically what this means is that this use effect hook here will fire whenever the value of name changes. So here's what we can do with that. Let's say that we want to show the user an error if their name is, let's say, less than 2 characters long. Okay? Well, the way we would do that is inside this use effect hook, we would say if name.length is less than 2, then what we could do is say console.log and just tell the user name must be 2 or more characters. Now, obviously, showing errors in the browser console isn't what we would want to do in most cases, but this is just for example. So let's take a look at our application now, and what we're going to see, Oh, first we need to actually display the controlled form inside our app component. So let's import that. Say import controlled form from controlled form. And we'll display our controlled form like that. And let's just refresh this and remove so that we're at localhost 3000. And let's start typing something into the name. All right. So we can see that when the name is one character, we get this error printed out that says name must be 2 or more characters. And then as we continue typing, it gets rid of that. Now, the way you would actually use this in a React app would look something like this. You'd probably have a state that would be something like name input error, set name input error, equals use state, and it would just be an empty string at first. And you could display that inside the form if you wanted to. So you could say name input error, and then you might just have a paragraph tag that displays it. So you would say name input error. And then if name.length is less than 2, what you would do is you would say set name input error, and you could just display some kind of message like name must be 2 or more characters. And then you would add an else block to this if statement saying set name input error to nothing, right? So in other words, if the name is 2 or more characters, we don't want to show an error. And what this would look like, if we go back to our application, is we see that immediately it's displaying name must be 2 or more characters. As soon as we input something that's valid, it gets rid of that error. So as you can see, controlled forms are really just much better for doing interactive stuff like that. Okay, the next example of uncontrolled and controlled components that we're going to take a look at is modals. Now, in this case, we actually already have an uncontrolled version of a modal component from earlier in the course when we created this modal. Now, this modal is uncontrolled, and the reason we say that is that the modal itself is the one that's controlling whether or not it's shown, and it also controls when it's hidden. And there's a few problems with this setup. The main problem is that none of the other components, right? For example, if we want to display this in our app component, which we can do by importing it here and displaying it here. Let's refresh it there, and we can take a look at it. Okay. The problem is that the parent component really has no control over what this modal is doing. So let's say that we had another button on our page that we wanted to display the modal. Right? Let's say that we had a button under here that says show modal or something like that. Well, there's really no way for this button now to make this modal display itself because, again, the modal is the only one that has control over its state. So what we're going to do here is take a look at how to transform this modal into a controlled modal that the parent component can actually manipulate in the way that it needs to. So first of all, let's rename this modal here to uncontrolled modal. We're going to rename it here, uncontrolled modal. Okay. And of course, we'll change the name inside the file to uncontrolled modal. Change the import here to uncontrolled modal as well. And it looks like it already changed the file path for me. Okay, so let's create another modal called controlled modal. All right, we'll just put that in here, controlled modal.js. We're going to copy and paste all of the code from our uncontrolled modal into there and make a few changes to it. So let's change the name first of all. We'll say controlled modal. All right, and the main change we're going to make here is instead of having our controlled modal use this use state hook to determine whether or not it should show, we're going to pass that in as a prop. So we'll say should show and remove the use state hook. Okay, so we don't even need to import it anymore. And we're also going to pass in a prop called onClose. All right. Any of you who have used the React modal library in the past may be used to seeing this as onRequestClose, right? And that's probably a more accurate description of what this is doing, as you'll see. So basically what this is going to do is shouldShow is going to be a Boolean that's passed in from the parent component. So the parent component is going to control whether the controlled modal is shown or not, hence the name controlled. And this onRequestClose function is going to allow the modal itself to request that the parent component stop showing it. Now, that will obviously only be one way that the parent component can stop showing it. The parent component will have the ultimate say over whether the modal shows up or not. Okay, so let's change all of these set should show true things to just onRequestClose. Right? They don't need to take any arguments or anything. As you'll see, we're going to say onRequestClose. And onRequestClose. Oh, and we don't even need this button anymore, really, since the parent component will be the one that displays the button that will actually show the modal. So let's remove that button there. And we can also shorten this up a little bit so that we just say return. If shouldShow is true, we're going to show all of that JSX. Otherwise, what we're going to do is simply return null from this component. There we go. So let's see what using this controlled modal is going to look like now. Well, first of all, our app component is going to have a state that keeps track of whether the controlled modal should be shown or not. So we'll import the useState hook here from React. We're going to display our controlled modal here, which we'll have to import up at the top. We'll say import controlled modal from controlled modal. And then what we're going to do is define a prop up here that says something like shouldShow modal and set shouldShow modal equals useState, and we'll set that state to false. Okay? And what we can do now is we can have this button outside the controlled modal component determine whether the modal should be shown. So we're going to say onClick. We'll have that onClick event set shouldShow modal to the opposite of shouldShow modal. So it's basically toggling that state variable from true to false, or from false to true. And we can also use this shouldShow modal variable to determine the text of the button, right? Whether it's show modal or hide modal. So we can say something like shouldShow modal. If the modal is already showing, we want this to say hide modal. Otherwise, we want it to say show modal. And then what we need to do is just pass in some of the props to our controlled modal. Remember that those props are going to be something like shouldShow equals shouldShow modal. We have an onRequestClose function. And basically what we're going to do here is just pass in a function that will set shouldShow modal to false. Okay. And one other thing that we would be able to do here is we could display an alert or something like that that says, you know, are you sure? That kind of thing, before we actually allow it to close. But I'm not going to do that here. So we'll just set it to set shouldShow modal false. We can actually make that a lot smaller if we do it like that. And then, of course, we want to pass children to our controlled modal. So let's remove this closing tag thing here. There we go. And we'll just have some kind of heading in there. We'll just say hello for now. All right, so what this is going to look like now, let's head over to our application again. We might have to refresh it here. We're going to say show modal. And we can see that obviously the button changes to hide modal, although I'm realizing now that we can't really click on it here. But what we can do is click hide modal here, and that will call the onRequestClose prop of the modal, which we've set in our app component to actually close the modal. Okay, so that's what a controlled version of a modal is going to look like. Basically, the modal itself isn't taking care of handling anything about its state. The parent component is the one doing all of that. All right, the last example of controlled and uncontrolled components that we're going to take a look at is onboarding flows. Now, an onboarding flow is basically just a component that displays different steps in an onboarding process. So step 1 might ask for the user's name, step 2 might ask for their age, step 3 might ask for their billing information, etc. So first, let's start off by building an uncontrolled version of an onboarding flow, and after that we'll see what it looks like if we convert that into a controlled version and some of the benefits that that provides us with. So we're going to start off here by creating a new component which we'll call uncontrolled onboarding flow. So we're going to say new file, uncontrolled onboarding flow.js. And here's what this is going to look like. We're going to start off by saying import React and use state from React. You'll see how we use those in a second. And our component is going to look like this. We'll say export const uncontrolled onboarding flow. And it's going to take the children that we pass to it. You'll see what this looks like in just a minute. And it's also going to take an onFinish prop. Now, this onFinish prop is basically just a function that's going to get called when the uncontrolled onboarding flow completes. In other words, when it's gone through all of its children that we pass to it. Okay? So now we have the body of our component, which is going to look like this. We're going to start off by defining two different state variables. The first state variable is going to be called onboarding data. This state variable is basically going to contain all of the data that we collect from the user over the course of their onboarding. It's basically going to be an object with keys, as you'll see in a minute. So we have onboarding data, set onboarding data equals use state. The initial value is going to be an empty object. Again, you'll see what that looks like in a minute. And the second state variable we're going to define is going to be the current index of the step that we want to display. Okay, so we're basically going to use this to determine which of the children that we pass to our onboarding flow is going to be shown. Okay, and this is going to be use state. The initial value is going to be 0, so we're starting on the first child. And once we've done that, we're going to basically get the current child using the current index and this children prop. So that's going to look like this. We'll say const current child equals react.children.toArray children. Basically, this just covers us in the case that children is only a single element, where children wouldn't actually be an array. And then we're going to get the current index from children. Okay? And before we move on to defining what the JSX of our component is actually going to look like, let's talk about how we're actually going to use this uncontrolled onboarding flow component. Basically what it's going to look like, and I'm just going to remove all of the other components that we're not going to be using now. Okay, and we'll import our uncontrolled onboarding flow from uncontrolled onboarding flow and display it like this. So basically what this is going to look like is inside our uncontrolled onboarding flow, we're going to have several other components, each of which represents a step in the onboarding flow. So what I'm going to do is just define a few very simple components. We'll say const step 1, and we'll return a very simple component that just says step 1. And then we'll do steps 2 and 3 as well. So we'll have step 2, which will say step 2, and step 3, which will say step 3. There we go. So we're going to basically display these step components inside the uncontrolled onboarding flow, like this: step 1, step 2, and step 3. And our uncontrolled onboarding flow is basically going to control which of these components actually gets displayed on the page. In other words, if the current index is 1, it's going to display step 2. If the current index is 0, it'll display step 1. You get the idea. And let's also remove this should show modal thing here. We don't need that anymore. Okay. So now that we know how our uncontrolled onboarding flow component is actually going to work with other components, basically all we need to do is return the current child. Now the problem with this will work. If we take a look at this, we'll see that it's displaying only step 1, right, since the current index starts off on 0, but the components themselves, steps 1, 2, and 3, don't actually have any way to go to the next step. So there's two ways we could do this. One way would be to simply give our uncontrolled onboarding flow the ability to do that. Let me show you what I mean. We could say return inside React fragments here. We're going to say current child. And then underneath the current child, we could have previous and next buttons. So we could say button, previous, and button next. Okay? And what that would do essentially is give us the ability to change those there, basically either by adding 1 to the current index or subtracting 1 from the current index. Okay? But that's not the approach that I'm actually going to take. The approach that I'm going to take is to pass a prop to each of the children that they can then access. This is similar to what we did with container components. So basically, each of these components is going to have access to a prop called something like goToNext, which will be a function that they can call to tell the uncontrolled onboarding flow to go to the next step in the onboarding process. Okay, so we're going to say goToNext, goToNext, goToNext. And for each of these components, we're basically going to have it look like this. We'll have a React fragment, and we'll have a button that says onClick equals goToNext. All right, and we'll do that for all of our steps. So I'm just going to copy and paste step 1 for steps 2 and 3, like that. Say step 2, change this to step 2, and step 3, and change this to step 3. Okay, and the way that these components are actually going to get this goToNext prop is inside our uncontrolled onboarding flow, we're going to define it. So we'll say const goToNext. We'll define that in just a second, but the way this is going to work, just like with container components, we're going to say if react.isValidElement current child, we want to clone that child and add this goToNext function as a prop. So we're going to say return react.cloneElement current child, and the extra prop is going to be this goToNext function. And then we'll say return current child. All right, and for now, what we're going to do is just have goToNext increment the current index by saying set current index to current index plus 1. All right, so we'll see that this should work if we click on it. Obviously, when we exceed the index bounds, it doesn't show anything. Okay, so that's the beginning of our uncontrolled onboarding flow. Next, let's take a look at how to work with this onboarding data thing. Basically, the onboarding data is just going to contain the data that we've collected in each of our steps. So the first thing we're going to do is modify our goToNext function here so that it allows each component, right, each step in the onboarding flow to pass in some kind of data to it. Okay, so we're going to have an argument here that will be called step data. And this step data is basically just going to be an object that contains some keys and values, whatever keys and values the current step needs to add to the state. You'll see what that looks like in just a second. So let's change the body of our goToNext function a little bit. First, what we're going to do is say const next index equals current index plus 1. All right, and then we're going to calculate the updated data from our existing onboarding data and the data that the new step is trying to add. So we'll say const updated data equals ... onboarding data ... step data. Basically just combining those two objects together. Okay, and just for visibility, let's log out this updated data. We'll say console.log updated data. And then what we're going to do is check if this next index is in the bounds of how many children we have by saying if next index is less than children.length. If it is, we're going to say set current index to next index. Otherwise, what we're going to do is call this onFinish prop with the onboarding data that we've accumulated. So we're going to say else onFinish updated data. Okay, and we're going to change this set current index here. We don't need that anymore, so we'll just delete it. This is going to be set onboarding data to updated data. All right, so the way this is going to work is each of our steps now is going to call go to next with some object containing whatever data they want to add to the onboarding state. So let's say that step 1 was supposed to collect the user's name. You can go ahead and add an input there if you want and a state. Just for simplicity's sake, what I'm going to do is say anonymous function go to next, and we're going to pass an argument there that says name John Doe. For step 2, let's say that step 2 was supposed to collect the user's age. Again, feel free to add an input there and actually do that. But for simplicity, I'm going to just say go to next and pass age 100. And let's say that step 3 was supposed to get their hair color. So what we're going to do is say go to next, hair color, brown. All right, so we have our 3 steps. Each one of those is adding its own data to the onboarding state. And the last thing we're going to do is pass a prop to uncontrolled onboarding flow called onFinish. And basically when our flow finishes, what we're going to do is just console log all of the data. And maybe we'll also display an alert saying that you've finished onboarding or something like that. So we'll say alert onboarding complete. All right, so let's see what this looks like. We're going to go back here and click on next. Oh, and let's open up our inspector window so that we can see how the state updates as we go along. So we can see right now that the state now has a property name equal to John Doe that was added by step 1. We're going to click next on step 2, which will add the age to the onboarding state. All right, so we see that this is what the onboarding state looks like now. And finally, we're going to click on next on step 3, which will log out the updated state as well as display onboarding complete. All right, so one of these, keep in mind, is coming from the go to next function. The other one is coming from the onFinish function that we have here. So we're console logging that data. Now again, this onboarding component is considered to be uncontrolled because the app component that's displaying it really has very little control over what it's doing. So again, let's say that we wanted to show and hide certain steps based on the data contained in the uncontrolled onboarding flow. Currently, there's really no way to do that, and that's why we're going to take a look at how to make this onboarding flow controlled. Okay, so we've seen how to create an uncontrolled onboarding flow component. Let's take a look at how we can convert this component into a controlled component. So the first thing we're going to do is create a new file for our controlled onboarding flow component, which we'll of course call controlled onboarding flow.js. And inside here, what we're going to do is copy and paste all of the code from our uncontrolled onboarding flow. And we'll start off by changing the name here to controlled onboarding flow. And just like we saw with our modal component, the main change we're going to make here is instead of keeping track of the onboarding data and current index inside the onboarding flow itself, we're going to pass those things in as props from the parent component. So in addition to having children and onFinish as props, it's also going to take a current index prop and an onNext prop. All right, so you'll see how the onboarding data and current index change here. We're going to remove these 2 state variables, and we can get rid of useState here as well. And the next thing we're going to do is instead of having all this go to next logic inside our controlled onboarding flow, we're going to move that up into the parent component, which in our case is going to be the app component. So let's copy that, and we'll paste it in here. And we're also going to need to add some state variables to our app component. So let's import our use state hook from React. And we're going to create the same two state variables that we had inside our uncontrolled onboarding flow. In fact, we can just copy and paste those from there, actually. We're just going to copy these two, put them in our app component. And we'll come back and fix some of this stuff in GoToNext in a minute. But what we're going to do first is change this from uncontrolled onboarding flow to controlled onboarding flow. Okay, controlled onboarding flow. And we're also going to simplify this GoToNext thing here. What we're going to do is simply say set onboarding data to current onboarding data, right? So onboarding data and step data. We're just using the spread operator there to combine those two. And under that, we're going to say set current index to current index plus 1. Okay? And let's also change the name of GoToNext to just onNext. And we'll pass it to our controlled onboarding flow. So we're going to delete those props there. We're going to pass in the current index, since we have that as a state variable now in our app component. So current index equals current index. Oops, I imported something accidentally. And we're also going to pass onNext to the onNext prop of our controlled onboarding flow. And then what we're going to do is really simplify the GoToNext function from our controlled onboarding flow. We're going to remove the entire body and change that to simply call the onNext function that we're getting passed in as a prop here. So we'll say onNext and call that with the step data. And this GoToNext, of course, is getting passed to all the children, so that's going to work exactly the same way. And we should be good to go now. If we go back to our app and click on Next, we should see that it works just like before. Now, the benefit of having this as a controlled component, as I mentioned before, is that it gives us much more control over certain changes that we might want to make to the onboarding flow. So as an example, right, we're collecting the user's name, age, and hair color. What if, based on their age, we wanted to tell the user whether they qualified for our site's senior discount or something like that? Well, here's what that would look like. I'm going to add another step in between the old step 3 and step 2. We're going to change this last one to step 4. Okay, and in step 3, we're not going to pass anything to GoToNext. We're just going to pass an empty object here. And we're going to say something like, congratulations, you qualify for our senior discount. Something like that, right? Now, we obviously don't want to show this step to users who are under a certain age. I think in America it's 62 or something like that. So what we can actually do, because our app component now has access to the current state of the onboarding, right, what index it's on, and the onboarding data, what we can do is we can only display step 3 if a certain condition is met. In our case here, and we're going to add step 4 there as well, in our case here, we can say something like, if onboarding data.age is greater than or equal to 62, then we want to show step 3. Otherwise, we want to skip straight to step 4. So what's going to happen now, because we're setting age to 100 in step 2, we should see step 3 show up. So I'm going to just refresh this so we go back to step 1. And I'm going to click Next, Next, and we, of course, see step 3 and click Next and go to step 4. However, if we change this now to something less than 62, right, if we say 50, for example, and refresh, we're going to see that we'll skip straight over step 3. So essentially what this controlled onboarding flow gives us is much more flexibility over what our onboarding flow looks like and how it changes as we go on.